Part of the ongoing genocide on the Palestinian people is the intensified propaganda war on Palestinian history. As more and more people begin to learn about Zionist settler colonialism and break with the human rights defending charade of bourgeois hegemony, they inevitably encounter the period where the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began to unfold in full force from 1947 to 1949, in which the majority of the indigenous population was expelled out of their homeland. And it is this part in Palestinian history which holds everything together, which turned most of us into anti-Zionists, which is the, quote, key site of Palestinian collective consciousness and the single most important event that connects all Palestinians to a specific point in time. It is for this reason why the particularly filthy ruling class of Germany, which is yet again exhilarated to support another genocide, has launched a propaganda campaign of denying the planned ethnic cleansing, which came about with the creation of the State of Israel, as a myth. The Social Democrats of the SPD and the conservative CDU are united once more in their genocidal racism, distributing leaflets in schools titled The Myth of Israel 1948, with which they desperately try to prevent the young from learning the truth. A truth which is not complex or a particular narrative, but a simple truth, easily understood by anyone. In this video, we're gonna expose the most important of these lies, and we're gonna plunge deep into the history of the seminal catastrophe, an inevitable outcome of the Zionist project and ideology, masterminded by a covert group of Israel's most renowned figures, now celebrated as war heroes. The historical disaster that never ended, known by Palestinians as the Nakba. In the 1920s, 20 years before the start of the Nakba, Palestinians made up between 80 to 90% of the population, and still, the Palestinian political leadership had agreed in 1929 to allow the Zionist settlement movement equal representation in future state institutions. After all, the British were the ruling power, and by now it was clear to almost everyone that they clearly stood on the side of Zionism. But shared representation was not what the Zionists wanted. So they rejected the deal. This, along with the rapidly expanding land purchases and evictions by the Jewish National Fund, led to deadly riots. By now it was clear the tensions were about to explode in an unprecedented way. One particular faction split from the Haganah, the Zionist paramilitary organization, since their methods of quote-unquote defense during the riots weren't fascist enough. That new paramilitary was named Irgun, organized by people from the more right-wing current, referred to as revisionist Zionism. To get an idea of what these people thought, one can check articles by a prominent revisionist Zionist newspaper in the 30s which explained that the Nazi movement, quote, has both a shell and a kernel. The anti-Semitic shell is to be discarded, but not the anti-Marxist kernel. When Hitler was rising to power in 1933, it celebrated the Führer among the shining names like Kemal Atatürk and Benito Mussolini. Quote, Hitler has still not caused as much evil as Stalin has. If you look at the Irgun emblem, you notice something interesting. Its map shows both Palestine and what was then called Transjordan. The Palestine Mandate first included Transjordan. It later changed to excluded, which the fascists wanted to revise, as they saw this area as part of the future Jewish state, hence the designation revisionist Zionism. Some years later, another faction would split from the Irgun, Lehi, better known as the Stern Gang. It would more than once seek an alliance with Nazi Germany, aiming to create the Jewish state based on, quote, nationalist and totalitarian principles and linked to the German Reich by an alliance. Soon after the start of the current genocide, Israeli and some Western media outlets fawned over an ex-Lehi sweet fascist grandpa joining the slaughter.
שלא הם, לא אמא שלהם, לא הילדה שלהם, לא התינוקות שלהם, אסור להם לחיות לחיות האלה.
However, it wasn't just the right wing. The undisputed leader of the Zionist movement, the quote-unquote socialist David Ben-Gurion, saw Transjordan as part of the future Jewish state as well. Not just that, the most important Zionist in history envisioned the Jewish state extending into Lebanon, Syria, and even considered the Sinai. Even the supposedly communist Hashomer HaTzair, the kibbutz movement, which regarded itself as to the left of the future founder of Israel, asserted the right of Jews to settle there. From the beginning, the difference between left-wing and right-wing Zionism was the speed and subtlety of settler colonialism. Whereas the Netanyahus want to conquer quickly, left and liberal Zionists tend to emphasize international opinion more in their more subtle conquest, as will be shown in this video. In part 2 of this series, we introduced Ben-Gurion and the various so-called socialist Zionist parties he led, which had founded the Haganah, the main command and fighting force of the Zionists. The Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern Gang, while differing in tactics, would be united into one military arm during the Nakba, together forming the Israeli Defense Forces. From 1930, the Palestinian political parties were institutionalized under the Arab Higher Committee, short AHC. In the following years, the AHC sought a compromise with the British, who didn't really care about its demands. Palestinian national politics had been under semi-feudal control, which differed from the other Arab national movements. Whereas other Arab ruling classes wanted for the most part to enter into collaboration with the imperialist powers, the Palestinian ones were less inclined to do so due to the presence of the Zionist movement, which was favored by the colonial British, and thus threatened the position of the Palestinian landlord class and emerging capitalist leaders. Still, Britain had funded and installed dependable Palestinian leaders which could pacify the increasingly frustrated toiling population and could reliably serve British interests. The position of the Mufti of Jerusalem was artificially elevated by the Mandate leadership to be more powerful. A certain Hajj Amin from the elite Husseini family was put in place by the British against other competitors to keep Palestinians at bay, especially those among the Palestinian working class and the peasantry, who became more and more destitute due to the Zionists' conquest of land and labor. By 1935, Zionists controlled the vast majority of industrial companies in which Jewish workers outnumbered Arab workers by more than 3 times, earning on average 145% more than the Palestinians. The British-supported Zionist capitalists hampered the emergence of a Palestinian national bourgeoisie, and, under the ethno-supremacist slogan of Jewish labor only, the labor Zionists who dominated the unions virtually eliminated progressive Arab leaders from the labor movement, which further opened the ground for the Palestinian semi-feudal leadership to gain hold over national politics. It is said that the Mufti Hajj Amin ordered the assassination of the main Palestinian labor leader at the time, Sami Taha. The Palestine Communist Party, predominantly Jewish, also bears the responsibility for the weakness of Palestinian working-class politics. In 1920, it put out a statement saying, "The Jewish workers are here to live with you. They have not come to persecute you. They are ready to fight on your side against the capitalist enemy, be it Jew, Arab, or British." Remarkably, nowhere did they mention Zionism, even though it was the primary threat for both Palestinians and their own party, which thus remained isolated, reminding us of some left-wing currents today. It was only during its 7th Congress in 1930 when it admitted that it had, quote, essentially adopted an erroneous attitude toward the issue of Palestinian nationalism. While the Communist Party changed its slogan, its practice remained largely the same and never underwent Arabization as demanded by the Communist International and its own sloganeering. Those who suffered the most were among the Palestinian majority working in agriculture. High taxes imposed by the British and the capitalist development, dominated by the Zionist bourgeoisie, allied with the fascist labor movement, also ruined the Palestinian peasants and farm workers, who faced escalating evictions by Zionist land buyers as discussed in the last part. The Zionist invasion ruined their way of life in which honor and dignity through connection to the land was essential. Hence, they constituted the poorest and most politically conscious section of the population, the most willing to wage war against their oppressor, ignited through the leadership of a man whose name was to be eternalized in the memories of Palestinian resistance. The Great Revolt, known to Palestinians as Al-Thawra al-Kubra, often referred to as the First Intifada, was the first time the Palestinian people rose up as a mass national movement. The Kufiyyeh emerged here for the first time as a symbol of the Palestinian resistance. Without understanding this uprising, one cannot fully explain the Nakba. Ghazan Kanafani would write that the Palestinian defeat during the Nakba, quote, was amazingly short because it was only the conclusion of a long and bloody chapter which had lasted from April 36 to September 39. It's generally believed that the uprising led by the exiled Syrian preacher Izz-al-Din al-Qassam in late 35 sparked off the Great Revolt, finally materializing the frustration by the most exploited Palestinian sectors with the vacillating Palestinian elite, who bet on negotiations with the British while delaying direct confrontation. After al-Qassam was killed by Zionist forces, his funeral was attended by thousands of poor peasants and workers. Al-Qassam had died, but the Intifada was born, and his legacy was ensured when the military wing of Hamas was named Izz-al-Din al-Qassam Brigades. The AHC leaders realized that if they didn't follow the tsunami of resistance, it would engulf them. The Mufti would later claim that he had been personal friends with al-Qassam all along, but the Palestinian masses continued to outpace the national leadership, which did not represent them, as 90% of revolutionaries were poor peasant volunteers. The new Mufti, due to his later visits and talks with Nazi Germany, serves to this day as a proof for Zionists that Palestinian national ideology is in truth Nazism. Netanyahu even went to Holocaust revisionism by blaming him for the European fascists' genocide on the Jewish people. Thousands of Palestinians had volunteered and died in the fight against Nazi Germany, while the Jewish Agency struck a deal with the Nazis, circumventing a Jewish boycott, and while a Haganah representative had met with German intelligence agent Adolf Eichmann, an architect of the Holocaust. In return for providing inside information about Jewish plots against prominent Nazis, the SS would help to push German Jews to Palestine and nowhere else. The representative would thank Eichmann for supplying the Haganah with guns and ammunitions, which were used against the Palestinians during the Great Revolt. The Americans and Zionists favored the immediate entry of 2.5 million Jews that fled persecution into Palestine, as neither the US nor the UK were willing to take them in. 75% of them found refuge in the Soviet Union. Although around 100,000 refugees could enter the US between 1933 and 41, hundreds of thousands more applied to immigrate, but were denied. The US had introduced strict anti-immigration legislation from 1924. Israeli professor of history Shlomo Sant writes, absent this stern anti-immigration policy, it is doubtful whether the State of Israel could have been established. Ben-Gurion would tell his pseudo-socialist Mapai party that, quote, if I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by taking them to England, and only half of them to Eretz Israel, then I would choose the second alternative. The Zionists wanted the Jewish refugees to come to Palestine at any cost. This is most dramatically exemplified later in 1940, when the Haganah sunk a ship carrying almost 2,000 refugees, because the British redirected it to go to Mauritius. More than 200 Jewish people were killed in that attack. In Palestine, when a massive 6-month general strike was declared mid-1936, the AHC issued a statement in October with the demand to end the strike. Haj Amin and other leaders admitted they would end the revolt if the Arab rulers of other countries asked them to do so. And it was one Arab government in particular, which would soon reveal itself as a key Zionist collaborator during the Nakba and one of the chief opponents of Palestinian liberation. Palestinian politics has a huge impact on the politics of surrounding Arab states, and likewise, it is the Arab ruling classes which have always had massive influence on the fate of Palestine, particularly during the ethnic cleansing, which was soon to come. The Emirate of Transjordan was ruled by the noble Arab family from 1921. The family traces its descent from the Prophet's daughter Fatima. The Hashimites were kicked out of the Hejaz by the Saud dynasty in 1925, and one son would be installed as king of Syria and then of Iraq, while his younger brother, King Abdullah, who was more ambitious and played a central role during the Arab Revolt, would become the Emir of Transjordan, serving as the representative for British imperial interests. A deep faith that the Hashimites were destined to rule the Arab world inspired Abdullah to found a Hashimite empire in his vision for Greater Syria, which would include Palestine as a first step. Abdullah suggested to the colonial secretary at the time, a certain Winston Churchill, that he should be made king of Palestine as well, which was rejected by Churchill as Britain had already promised the country to Zionism. So, in London, Abdullah immediately entered into negotiations with the Zionists themselves. He offered Zionist organization chief Chaim Weizmann to support the Balfour Declaration if he accepted him as Emir of Palestine. He said that Jews could eventually form a relatively autonomous province within his Hashemite empire. But there were two problems. First, the Palestinians rejected Abdullah as their leader, just like they rejected the Zionists. And second, as we've seen, the Zionists wanted the whole of Palestine for themselves, including Transjordan. But negotiations would continue. Zionist business leaders would meet the Emir, promising him economic development in return for enriching his dynasty. Although stricken with contradictions, the secret meetings between these two players would prove disastrous for the fate of the Palestinian people. The British responded to the outbreak of the Great Revolt by appointing a royal commission in 1937, called the Peel Commission, to deal with the situation. For the first time, Britain would officially recommend partitioning the country into a Jewish and an Arab state, united with Transjordan. Of course, the term partition is a deceptively innocent-sounding euphemism for conquest, as it essentially hands over the people's land to settlers. So the Arab Higher Committee naturally refused, demanding an independent state of Palestine with protection of all legitimate Jewish and other minority rights and safeguarding of reasonable British interests. The Palestinian leadership also rejected Abdullah's goal to seize the Arab part, of course. The Zionist leaders generally welcomed partition, but, and here comes the part that Zionists deny, but which history confirms, that they only welcomed it as an initial, pragmatic step without abandoning the plans for the complete takeover of Palestine. Chaim Weizmann would write, quote, "The kingdom of David was smaller. Under Solomon, it became an empire. Who knows? It's the first step that counts." Ben-Gurion, an extremely tactically adept mind, would say the Peel Plan was, quote, "not the lesser of evils, but a political conquest and historical opportunity. I see in the realization of this plan practically the decisive stage in the beginning of full redemption and the most powerful lever for the gradual conquest of all of Palestine. Partition," he says, "gives us control over the coast of Palestine, large immigration, a Jewish army, and systematic colonization under state control. I do not see partition as the final solution of the Palestine question. Those who reject partition are right in their claim that this country cannot be partitioned because it constitutes one unit." Now, it's important that we're very clear what Ben-Gurion is saying here. It will explain what Zionism aimed to achieve not only during the ethnic cleansing operations that would soon arrive, but the essence of Israeli settler politics to this day. Speaking to the Zionist executive, he proclaimed, "After the formation of a large army in the wake of the establishment of the state, we will abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. A Jewish state is not the end, but the beginning. We shall organize an elite army, and then I am sure that we will not be prevented from settling in other parts of the country. In other words, from the river to the sea, we will colonize all of it." The Commission's partition project failed, but from now, partition would guide future policy tactics. But there was still one big problem for the Zionists. Even if they declared the Jewish state in Palestine, there would still be Arabs inside of it. Thus, the idea of transfer would become a centerpiece of Zionist thinking. Virtually all important Zionists would be in favor of it. The leftist Zionist Berl Katznelson, one of the most important ideologues at the time, a guy liberals often point to as one of the good ones, would speak at the 20th Zionist Conference, quote, "My conscience is completely clear. A distant neighbor is better than a close enemy. They will not lose by their transfer, and we certainly will not. In the final analysis, this is a political reform of benefit to both sides. For a long time, I have been convinced that this is the best solution." Ben-Gurion, in support of Kuznetsov, says, "The compulsory transfer of the Arabs from the valleys of the proposed Jewish state could give us something we never had. We are given an opportunity which we never dared to dream of in our wildest imaginings." He tells the Zionist Assembly in 1937, quote, "In many parts of the country, it will not be possible to settle without transferring the Arab Falahin. With compulsory transfer, we would have a vast area for settlement. I support compulsory transfer. I don't see anything immoral in it." Even leading Zionist historian Benny Morris writes, quote, "Transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism." By 1939, the Great Revolt was crushed, leaving thousands dead and imprisoned. 100,000 British soldiers were deployed to Palestine. That's about 1 colonial soldier per 8 Palestinians, far surpassing colonial military presence of most other countries. Palestinian political leadership, infrastructure, and military equipment was destroyed. 10% of the adult male Arab population were killed, imprisoned, or exiled by Britain. Meanwhile, the Zionist forces were trained in combat by collaborating with and being trained by the biggest colonial empire at the time, and would far surpass the Palestinian side. Now arrived the historical opportunity to start planning the implementation of the transfer idea. Palestine was devastated, but it was nothing compared to the impending cataclysm set to unfold very soon. The Zionist leaders knew they were in a position of strength and wasted no time in starting to make their first moves to finalize their plan for a Jewish state with as little Palestinians as possible. In 1942, Ben-Gurion convened a Zionist conference in the Biltmore Hotel in New York with hundreds of delegates, in which the Zionist movement openly called for turning the whole of Palestine into a Jewish state, thus altering the more vague wording of the Balfour Declaration. Still, Ben-Gurion knew that for the time being, all of Palestine was unrealistic and that 80% of it was enough to build a viable state. 2 years later, Ben-Gurion argued why depopulating Arabs is not as bad as people think. Quote, "The transfer of Arabs is easier than the transfer of any other people. There are Arab states around, and it is clear that if the Palestinian Arabs are transferred, this would improve their situation and not the opposite." Britain was only a second-rate imperialist power after World War II, and the new Labour government decided to leave India and focus on recovering its devastated economy and pacify the working class at home. The British decided on February 47 to leave Palestine in the hands of the newly formed United Nations. By 1947, 2/3 of the Palestinian population were Palestinians. The other third was Jewish settlers, most of whom had arrived in the past few decades. The inexperienced UN delegated the fate of the country to the Special Committee for Palestine, UNSCOP. None of its members had any experience with Palestine and with conflict solving in general. Zionists will say the UNSCOP decisions represented international opinion, but most countries of the Global South weren't yet included in the UN, otherwise the results would have looked a lot different. Many delegates were pressured by a massive campaign to switch their votes in order to reach a majority, such as the one from the Philippines. The Zionists tried to convince the UNSCOP to give them 80% of the land, but the UNSCOP members thought it was too much and said they'd give them 56%, so over half the country in which the vast majority of the population was non-Jewish. They would make sure that Jews made up a slight majority in that territory, a little more than half. But inside those proposed borders, Jews still constituted a minority in virtually every district, still owning just 11% of the land. Meanwhile, 42% of the land would be given to the Palestinians, in which they constituted about 99% of the population. The rest would be an international zone in Jerusalem, equally divided between the two groups. If the UN had made partition correspond with Zionist settlements, they would have allocated less than 10% to the settler colonial movement. Aside from the fact that numerically it didn't correspond with any reality whatsoever, politically it awarded an openly expansionist colonial movement part of the land of another people. As Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi wrote, Resolution 181 was a hasty act of granting half of Palestine to an ideological movement that declared openly already in the 30s its wish to de-Arabize Palestine. Naturally, the AHC boycotted and rejected the international corrupt proceedings, aiming to legitimize the conquest of their land. Again, in the words of Khalidi, the native people of Palestine, like the native people of every other country in the Arab world, Asia, Africa, America, and Europe, refused to divide the land with a settler community. This is something Ben-Gurion understood, later writing, quote, "If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs." To this day, Zionists will use indigenous refusal to let foreign powers decide the fate of their country as a stupid propaganda trick to say that while Zionists always wanted peace, the bloodthirsty Arabs wanted war. We will see just how peaceful and considerate the Zionists were in their dealing with Palestinians throughout the rest of the video. And also, notice how the UN partition plan doesn't correspond with the borders of so-called Israel today. We will soon learn why this isn't the case. Ben-Gurion, who now acted as both the de facto prime minister and defense minister of the Zionist movement, already expected the British to leave and began to make preparations for the takeover of Palestine. As the crucial moments of ethnic cleansing approached, Ben-Gurion began ignoring official Zionist structures to rely on a more secret outlet for decision-making, specifically for the cleansing operations. In one of the rare documents it is referred to as the Consultant Committee, Israeli historian Ilan Pappe calls it the consultancy. The members of this small, clandestine structure are not unknown, but famous Israeli war heroes. Among them, the legendary Yigael Yadin, head of operations, later the chief of staff of the IDF. Moshe Dayan, known as the fighting symbol of the new state of Israel and the future defense minister. Yigal Alon, head of Haganah's elite unit, the Palmach, later a general in the IDF and a leader of the Israeli labor parties. Yosef Weiss, head of the settlement department in the Jewish agency, who had declared, "The only solution is a land of Israel devoid of Arabs. There is no room here for compromise. Not one village can remain." Also present in meetings, Moshe Sharet, foreign policy head under the Jewish agency, and soon the second prime minister of Israel. Yitzhak Rabin, important officer in the cleansing operations, and the future commander-in-chief of the IDF, and the fifth prime minister of Israel. Issar Harel, head of intelligence, the most vicious department making ethnic cleansing decisions. His rich family had their assets seized by the Soviets. He would become the director of the Mossad and of Shin Bet, Israel's secret services, and one of the most powerful Zionists. Last but not least, the most important Zionist in history, the undisputed leader, David Ben-Gurion. The first meetings would take place at the home of the first prime minister, and soon the founder of the State of Israel. From now on, there were two main problems for the Zionist decision-makers. First, 56% of Palestine was way below what they wanted. Second, about half the population in the newly proposed Jewish state was Arab. This is not good. Within the Zionist halls of power, a recurring concept emerged, the balance, referring to the demographic balance between Jews and Arabs. Ben-Gurion, speaking to senior members of the Mapai, quote, "There are 40% non-Jews in the areas allocated to the Jewish state. This composition is not a solid basis for a Jewish state, and we have to face this new reality with all its severity and distinctness. Such a demographic balance questions our ability to maintain Jewish sovereignty. Only a state with at least 80% Jews is a viable and stable state." On October 7, 1947, 2 months before UN Resolution 181 was adopted, the Zionist leader reassured his close colleagues that there are no territorial boundaries for the future Jewish state. The Zionist leaders now waited for the historical opportunity to implement conquest and cleansing. About a month before the partition plan was adopted, Ben-Gurion speculated about the danger of the Palestinian population turning into a fifth column inside the Jewish state, and told the executive of the Jewish agency in the most explicit terms, quote, "They can either be mass arrested or expelled. It is better to expel them." Already in 1937, the Zionist leader had requested plans from the High Command in the case of British withdrawal. These were termed Plan A, then Plan B in 1946. These then merged into Plan C, or Gimel in Hebrew, which entailed directives such as killing the Palestinian political leadership, killing Palestinian insiders and their financial supporters, attacking nearby Palestinian villages likely to assist in future attacks, attacking Palestinian clubs, coffee houses, meeting places, etc. However, it was the newest version of the plan which would seal the fate of Palestinians, who weren't to be divided into opponents or collaborators anymore. A plan which called for the systematic expulsion of the Palestinian people as a whole. Its name, Plan D, otherwise known by using the Hebrew letter, Plan Dalet. The AHC called for a 3-day strike and protests after the UN adopted the partition resolution at the end of November 1947. But foreign journalists noted something peculiar. After just 3 days, the atmosphere cooled down. Partition was a disaster for Palestinians, but in a way it was nothing new for them, since they were used to being ruled by this or that foreign power for centuries. Most of them didn't realize what fate had in store for them, since this time the settler-colonizer aimed at displacing their whole ethnicity. The Council of the Arab League, composed of the foreign ministers of the Arab member states, recommended sending weapons to Palestinians and forming an all-Arab volunteer force, to be named the Arab Liberation Army, short ALA. Therefore, an exclusive group within the consultancy began meeting every day in December 47, one of the most intriguing months in this story. The first meetings were preoccupied with assessing the mood among the Palestinians. There, they noted something interesting. Despite the arrival of some volunteers in the villages, the Zionist intelligence units reported the villagers, quote, continued life as usual. This was a problem for the Zionist leadership, which was looking for a pretext to start the cleansing under the justification of tagmul, retaliation. But from December, the consultancy would start using the Hebrew word yotzma, initiative, which means taking action without waiting for a pretext for retaliation. It was the Palestinians among the upper classes in the cities who could leave the country first, in anticipation of the escalating violence. Zionist historians like Benny Morris classify this as voluntary flight. But if you leave your home with the intent of coming back, and you're denied the right to do so, well, this is called expulsion. The consultancy now considered systematic, violent acts to terrify the population out of their homes. After adopting this strategy, they would decide on a few villages for immediate implementation. The methods included randomly shooting at houses, such as in the village of Deir Ayyub, or arbitrarily blowing up houses in El Khisas, a village where Muslims and Christians had coexisted peacefully for a long time. 5 children were among the killed in that village. And it's important to note that all of this happened before the adoption of Plan Dalet in March of next year. This new policy was applied throughout the nation from mid-December. Haifa was the first city to be picked as a target. Terror campaigns had started from the first day since the adoption of the partition. Jewish settlers who typically lived higher up the mountain would snipe Arabs and shooting at panicking Palestinians leaving their houses with machine guns. The Haganah would disguise themselves as Arabs, bring cars filled with explosives to Palestinian garages for repair, and then blow them up. Naturally, people who feel their lives are in danger often choose to leave their homes. There's nothing voluntary about it. Intimidation terrorism now applied everywhere, directly aimed at displacement or provoking a response for pretext. However, the worst was yet to come. The grave of Izz-al-Din al-Qassam was located in the village of Balad el-Sheikh in the north. The massacre about to happen at this place introduced a new chapter in Palestinian history. A few hours before the start of the slaughter on the 31st of December, Yosef Weiss would complain to the consultancy, quote, "This is not enough." openly arguing for abandoning retaliation, intimidation, and pushing the implementation of his transfer idea. Quote, "Is it not now the time to get rid of them?" A local commander was ordered to encircle the village, kill the largest possible number of men, damage property, but refrain from attacking women and children. On that last day of 1947, the Zionist forces started their attack, which lasted for 3 hours, killing over 60 Palestinians, among them not just men. But the consultancy would decide in their next meeting that the distinction between men and women wasn't necessary anyway. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine was underway and was cemented at the next historic consultancy gathering. In the first meeting of the new year at Ben-Gurion's house, referred to as the Long Seminar, Yigal Allon expressed the need to up the aggression in regions that had been, quote, quiet for too long. Ben-Gurion concurred and recommended dropping the term retaliation. Quote, "This is not what we are doing. This is an offensive and we need to initiate preemptive strikes. No need for a village to attack us first. We have not used properly our ability to strangulate the economy of the Palestinians." The important commanders concurred. Allon put it more dramatically and pushed for collective punishments. Quote, "Even if there are children living in the attacked houses." After this meeting, one particular word would appear on all orders given by the consultancy to the High Command. Tihur. In English, cleansing. From now, Tihur would dominate all other political considerations. While the leadership acknowledged in private that Palestinians were no relevant threat, in public, Ben-Gurion would speak of the war aimed at destroying and eliminating the Jewish community, portraying those settlers who died as a result to indigenous resistance as, quote, "victims of the Second Holocaust." Meanwhile, Eliyahu Sasson of the consultancy reported that only 3,000 ALA poorly trained volunteers had entered Palestine, nothing compared to the tens of thousands of well-trained, heavily armed Zionist forces. One Palestinian would ask, "What do you want, a rifle to resist an airplane?" The start of the ethnic cleansing in the cities is usually associated with the expulsions that took place at a certain Arab neighborhood with a rich history in Haifa that no longer exists. Wadi Rushmiya, where the Haganah blew up its houses and expelled its community. All of this happened in front of the eyes of the British, which hadn't left Palestine yet, and were officially still tasked with ensuring security for the Palestinians all over the Mandate. The last High Commissioner in Palestine, Sir Alan Cunningham, mildly complained about the destruction happening in Haifa on a daily basis. He would tell Ben-Gurion that while Palestinians sought to preserve peace in the country, the Haganah did everything possible to escalate the situation. By February, the ethnic cleansing operations took a more systematic character. Zionist troops would perpetrate the massacre of the village of Sabbagh-Khoury and destroy all its houses. The kibbutz Sasa, the name stolen but made easier for Europeans to pronounce, was built on top of its rubbles. Some houses remained, now serving as a Sasa tourist attraction. Again, the consultancy noted that, quote, "the villagers show no wish to fight." All consultancy attendees unanimously stated that rural Palestine lacked any inclination to fight or attack and was defenseless. The ALA troops were only active in the areas the UN assigned to the Palestinian state anyway. Ben-Gurion was impressed by the Sabbagh-Khoury operation and the escalating destruction. Quote, "A destroyed house, nothing. Destroy a neighborhood, and you begin to make an impression." Allon explained, quote, "If we destroy whole neighborhoods or many houses in the village, as we did in Sabbagh-Khoury, we make an impression." Here, left and right Zionist currents were in agreement. The Stern Gang would demand in its pamphlets, quote, "destroy Arab neighborhoods and punish Arab villages." It had brutally assaulted the village of Lifta near Jerusalem out of its own decision. This is normal in ethnic cleansing. Not everything happens in a planned manner. Leftist Zionists will concede that yes, there were horrible things happening during the Nakba, without denouncing the whole thing. However, while the Haganah High Command condemned the Stern Gang at first, it incorporated its tactics into its scheme afterwards, themselves ordering another attack on the same village. Joseph Weiss ordered a number of assaults in these early months, such as the depopulation of the village of Kira, quote, "Get rid of them, now." But Penny Morris would explain that this happened without the authorization of the quote-unquote political leadership. However, this is impossible, as the Haganah leadership would never condemn that operation and authorized all expulsion operations. In February, the US concluded that partition was a failure, later offering a ceasefire, which the Zionist leadership rejected, as they had recognized the historical opportunity to realize its dream of an exclusively Jewish state. But Ben-Gurion was dissatisfied. The speed and scale of expulsions did not match his ambition to conquer Palestine within that window of opportunity. From March 1948, the final Masterplan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine would commence in full force, forever shaping its history. Zionists claim that Palestinians weren't expelled, but fled during the war which was about to break out in May 1948. However, ethnic cleansing hadn't even shifted yet to high gear, when 250,000 people were already displaced before the Arab governments reluctantly sent their forces into Palestine on May 15th, one day after Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine. I remind you that this whole video hasn't even been about the implementation of Plan Dalet from March and the high point of the Nakba, which today is commemorated on that same May 15th. This will all be the topic of the next part. The Arab League was not interested at all in seriously defending Palestine, as will be shown in the next video. It had set up the ALA as a counter to indigenous fighters. The Arab governments would prevent thousands of volunteers from joining the fight. Jordan in particular, whose army was the only one capable of seriously defending Palestine, was already in serious talks with the Zionists about sharing the spoils of Palestine between themselves. But more on that next time. From March, some Wednesday meetings of the consultancy took place in the notorious Red House, the headquarters of the Haganah High Command at the time. The brigades would receive the order to enter into State D to execute Plan Dalet. Quote, "You will move to State Dalet for an operative implementation of Plan Dalet. The villages which you will capture, cleanse, or destroy will be decided according to the consultation with your advisors on Arab affairs and the intelligence officers." The Red House was a typical early building in Tel Aviv and was intended to be the headquarters of the local workers' union. It was from inside the Labor Zionist building where the most notorious massacres in Palestinian history were orchestrated. It was beneath Marxist-style posters where the perverters of socialism would start executing the plan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, today still experienced and remembered as the Nakba.